Hello and welcome to the show. I'm your host, Jason Knight, and in this episode we peer deep into the dark depths of product management. Product management can be a challenging career in a number of ways, and we talk about some of the reasons why, some of the ways to mitigate them, how product leaders can ensure psychological safety for their teams, and how intense physical activity like boxing can be a valuable outlet. So, seconds out, round one, it's one night in product. So, my guest today is Marc Abraham, Head of Product Engagement at Asos.com. So I can assure you he's very well dressed, at least his top half. Marc's a product leader, co-curator at Mind the Product, global organizer for Product Tank. On top of that, he's also managed to write 2 books, My Product Management Toolkit and Managing Product Equals Managing Tension. Also a keen boxer, so I'm expecting some insightful uppercuts. How you doing, Marc?
I'm good. Love that intro. Thank you for having me, Jason.
As I've said to many people before, I try to put as much effort into the intro because then the rest of the podcast doesn't matter. So, first question. Yeah, that's quite a portfolio of activities that you're involved in. How do you find time to sleep?
I could do better at that, is the honest answer, but I still sleep somehow, yes.
Fair enough. So, product management. It's stressful. It's difficult to explain. You're under attack from all sides. There's no clarity. You get all the blame, none of the credit, and half the time it feels like companies don't even really know what they're getting themselves into or what success looks like. You've literally written a book on this. So from one product guide to another, why do we put ourselves through this?
Well, because it's a good question, and it's a question that on bad days I ask myself quite a lot. Like, why did I choose this, career? Why did I choose that? But the reason why I wrote Managing Product Equals Managing Tension is because it is such a difficult and challenging job. The reason why I think it's worth doing, because there's lots of tensions there, that if you make the most of them, you can really get to the exciting part of being a product person, which is solving customer problems, delivering value to customers, which equates into business value too. But the risk is there. And again, that's the reason for writing this book, is that if we get too stuck into the tensions and the challenges and the frustrations, which I argue are inherent to being a product person, we don't get to the exciting part or the kind of end goal of why we're doing this role in the first place, which is solving customer problems and addressing customer needs.
And how much of that, or how much of those tensions do you feel are just part of just jobs versus being very specific to product management? Because a colleague of mine from time to time will come up with the kind of obvious but also kind of insightful phrase like, work is hard. And obviously work is hard, and no one's going to sit there saying that they've got an easy job. But how much of that do you think is generic versus specific?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and you see some of the tensions that I do describe, I'm sure will resonate with people who are not product people. No doubt things like difficulties in collaborating, communicating with people. You're dealing with people, so that can be hard, and lots of problems I find in the workplace, whether you're a product person or a non-product person, are related to people. But then again, I think there's a number of challenges and tensions that are specific to being a product person, because it's such a funny role if you think about it, where we're right in the middle. We're operating at the intersection of customer experience, business needs and commercial needs, working with people who have to implement, whether it's designers, developers, the builders. And we need to get all these people on the same journey, get them to align, but we don't have any authority over them. We're just circling in the middle around them. And that in itself, that is quite unique to this role of being a product person, in my experience, which leads to a lot of extra tensions that you don't necessarily get, I think, if you're working in, let's say, finance.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess in finance, they're all just throwing money at each other all the time, right? So I've read the book. I found it very insightful, and obviously, as a product person myself, empathise with a lot of the contents. But and we've covered it slightly already, but for my listeners' benefit, why should they read the book?
I think particularly if you find yourself wondering, like, what did I pick this role? Why am I
Same
doing
question from earlier, right? Like,
exactly?
why the hell am I here?
Why am I doing this? Why am I keeping up with this? And especially on a bad day. So understanding that, because the first part of the book is about understanding, acknowledging those tensions. I find as product people, we talk a lot about the hard skills involved in managing products, which are super valuable. Don't get me wrong, whether it's being able to create a roadmap, look at the data, or come up with a product strategy. Really important stuff. We talk a lot less about the reality of the tensions and the challenges. And as someone who is in those kind of product trenches on a daily basis, I think it's important to talk about that and also enable us to, like I mentioned, both identify and acknowledge and accept to some degree those tensions and challenges. But in the second part of the book, I then go on to give a whole range of tools and techniques of dealing with those tensions and going even a step further, making the most of them. So almost using them for good, for the customer, for the business, for the product.
Yeah, it's almost like you just have to fall in love with it to some extent and accept it for what it is, which is obviously difficult to do because everything in your being is going to be pushing against that.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, sorry, Jason, I'm very honest about that. You know, I'm not saying this book is the holy grail, and every day you'll be floating and living a dreamy existence as a product person. And as you say, accepting is hard, but what I've tried to do through this book is at least understand the nature of some of these tensions, where they come from, and secondly, how to best manage them or deal with them.
And what's the feedback been so far from the book? I've obviously seen some people tagging you on things like LinkedIn and going, hey, good job and stuff like that. But in general, what's the feedback been like?
Yeah, so far, and I have to touch wood, but the feedback has been amazing. And I think that also what gave me the confidence to write the book in the first place was that this was initially a talk that I started doing about 2 years ago, where I talk very openly about my frustrations and the feelings I've experienced managing products. And initially it was a bit, like I said, 2 years ago, a bit hesitant about, should I do this? What will the response be? Will people get it? But I've done the talk a few times now, and every time I do it, people come to me afterwards saying, thank you so much for being so honest about these things, bringing it up. And I should tell you about my situation or challenge I'm experiencing. And that feedback has persisted with, now that the book has come out, I keep getting that kind of same feedback of, this is really useful, not only understanding where some of those challenges come from, but also how to best deal with them and not succumb to them.
Yeah, I just imagined like a queue of kind of depressed product managers coming to you like after they've read it and asking for further advice. And you, so does that happen? Do you get a lot of kind of almost requests for help afterwards, or is it sort of one level abstracted from that?
No, I do get that. I do, apart from my day job, I do quite a bit of coaching and mentoring as well. And I talk in the book about how those two can be different, but as part of that, I get that question anyway, because being a product person on a daily basis is hard, right? We can read all the books in the world, mine included, and think that's it. We're good. We're set. Or we can go to great events or courses, but the reality of it is just tricky.
Yeah, I've often considered a product to be quite a lonely career, and it's not lonely. I mean, obviously you're surrounded by people, and if you're lucky enough, you're going to have other people in your product team even, but there's this wonderful picture of like a dog being surrounded by cats, all kind of bullying him into the corner, and it's like that, it's like business UX and customer or whatever, and then the poor little product manager at the end. It's an interesting. I will say is definitely an interesting career, and I think one thing that kind of you touched on in the book, and it's something that I definitely think about, is a lot of people that go into product, I think they come from like sort of technical backgrounds, or yourself obviously from sort of project management background. And there's a lot of your worth is defined by the amount of work that you look like you're doing. And certainly for me, when I moved from being kind of a developer into more product ownership and product management, you start to think that, well, am I actually doing anything? And you start, getting stressed yourself. And I know you talk about sort of internal tensions as well as external tensions. But then when you move into product leadership, it's an additional. It's like that squared, because you're not like a day-to-day product manager is not really an individual contributor in the traditional sense. They're there to kind of enable other people. But then when you're that leader of product people, you're there to enable people who enable people, and therefore if you have any kind of imposter syndrome, then you're just sitting there like just feeling terrible a lot of the time, because you're not pushing things around on a screen so much anymore.
That is definitely true. It does not help your imposter syndrome. I think you're right. I've also seen, this risk of wanting to do too much of the doing and start micromanaging the people who you're supposed to be line managing or managing. So there's a risk there. But I feel that in that leadership role, there's so many other things that you can bring to the table that you can't necessarily do when you're working on a product on a day-to-day basis. And that's things like thinking about product strategy, giving guidance to the wider business, evangelizing the role and value of product as a mindset or as a function. But yeah, it is definitely a transition going from being in the detail day to day with a team of engineers and designers and stakeholders to going that level up, as you say.
Yeah, it's almost like they're two separate jobs in a way that have like different skill sets. It's not just that the head of product, for example, is just like the most senior product manager in a way. It's almost like you need to kind of shift your perspective slightly, which is interesting. And I don't think you tend to get a lot of training in that, which obviously adds to the tension.
It does. And again, this is something which some listeners might think who are not in product might think this is not unique to product, because managing people and dealing with people is something that, again, you have to do and you have to learn. It's not something you pick up from a book. And I've seen a lot of people, and again, I've been on that journey myself and still am, of I haven't managed people. How do I do that? Right? How do I go from the day-to-day detail to suddenly having to enable people to do the best that they can in their jobs?
Yeah, absolutely. Has anyone from your day job read the book that you're aware of?
I've given them copies, so you'd hope that at least one or two of them. We've got a big product function at Asos have read it.
But has it changed either the product team there, like some of their approaches, or has it maybe even changed the approaches of some of the people, some of the stakeholders of the product team, or is it too early for that yet?
I've also, funny you should mention that, because I've also been giving it to stakeholders to say, just read it or this situation. But literally, I was talking to a stakeholder the other day saying, what we're talking about right now, read my book, because I talk about it and it might give you some context. But joking aside, it's early days, but already what I've heard from some of my product people, so I manage a team of 16 product owners and product designers within the engagement area at Asos. And they've already said to me, and that was really quite telling, Marc, this is great, because it feels like I'm not alone. Going back to your point earlier about it feeling like a lonely career and thinking that the challenges that you're facing are unique to you as a person or your organization. And then you read a book like mine and you think, no, it's quite commonplace. Because again, in the book, it's not just me talking about these challenges. I talk to a lot of really experienced product people at a number of great organizations who share their stories and their experiences.
Yeah, no, I think, again, that whole kind of almost proxy community that it gives you, even though you're not necessarily talking to these people. And actually, it was interesting. I was thinking about this for this podcast yesterday, like trying to think of like ways to describe it to people and like what the point of it is. And, it's very grand to think that you're trying to help, on a large scale, but like it's all about just, sharing stories and experiences so that people know that this is one of the great things about having like a global community these days, right? It's like no one has to think that they're just the only person anymore.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But what made you get into book writing? I mean, this is your second book that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
Now, personally, I start sweating halfway through a Medium article, if I try and write that out. So is that something where like the words just come tumbling out kind of like a waterfall, or do you have to really put a lot of effort into to kind of keep yourself on? Because to me, it feels like I would just get even more stressed trying to write a book. And I know that other people that friends and people that I've spoken to that have, really agonized over that book. So why are you adding this additional stress to yourself?
Glutton for punishment. No, maybe again, to take a step back, I started blogging back in 2010. Can't believe it's that long ago. When I when I wanted to make the transition from project management, so I was working as a digital project manager, to product management. And I was still very early on in my career in digital. And I started blogging as a way of just capturing all the things that I was learning and trying to learn about this completely new space of being in digital in the first place, initially as a project manager, then wanted to get into product. And I literally called that blog, and it's still there. And I still keep it updated, try to write a post every week, every 2 weeks as I learn. And in a way, that also gave me a kind of, bit of a cover to say, this is not perfect because I'm learning about this stuff. I'm sharing what I'm learning. I'm not pretending to be some guru who's got all the answers. And I try to follow the same approach with my books as well. So I have to say, the words don't come tumbling out on paper. I'm good. These are very arduous kind of processes where I have to come up with a structure, think about the messages I want to get across, do an initial rough version, then read it myself to think, do I get across what I want to get across here? Then get some of my friends and peers to look at it, who will also give me, the editors are always right. So then you have extra work in implementing their feedback. So it is an onerous process, but what gives me a lot of pleasure is that process of going through, of having an idea and translating that into, whether it's a blog post or it's a book or a talk, but really taking that to the next level and saying, how can I help others with this idea that I have, or this point that I want to make?
But that's interesting, because you obviously just touched on the fact that before you were in product, you were in project management. I believe before that you were a lawyer.
Correct.
So that's quite the hero's journey. How did that kind of, like the short version? How did that happen? Because that's like a pivot and then another pivot. Were you always interested in kind of technology and sort of delivering solutions, or did you kind of come to that along the way?
Yeah, it was definitely the latter, because I always joke that when I started getting into digital, I hardly knew how to turn on my computer. And there's days when I still struggle. But be that as it may, no, I was a corporate lawyer. I felt the limitations of that, and that's what prompted me to do an MBA. That's how I initially came to the UK about 15 years ago. And then I realized, if I want to use any of this stuff that I've learned on this course, I can't go back to law. I stayed in professional services, working for a big accounting firm. And that's without even thinking about it. I had my first involvement in rolling out a software product, which was a firm-wide CRM system. And that triggered me to get, yes, but it was for someone who's a novice. That was a great experience working, because I did it from beginning to end, thinking about the functionality. And I didn't even think about it in those terms at the time, right? I just went through the steps, but onboarding stakeholders, getting their requirements, understanding the pain points. But that gave me a real taste for digital. And that's how I started hustling to try and get into digital. And as we said, initially as a project manager and then as a product manager.
So your first book, My Product Management Toolkit, obviously details a lot of fundamentals for product managers. And it was actually really interesting for me. I actually picked it up mainly because we were transferring some people that weren't product managers into the product organization. And I thought it would be like a good primer, which it was. But that came way after you made the transition yourself. So what did you use to get into that and to make that transition? Because as far as I can see, there's not a lot of resources out there that are that good. Well, they probably weren't then.
No. I started learning from all the places that I could, was one. So I did a product management as a 1-day course at the time. And looking back on it now, I'm thinking, that was actually very different to how I now see product, or what I think good could look like. But that's one thing I did. I read loads of articles that were available. So at least it gave me a grounding. And then a lot of it was also just, and I still try to stick to this mantra, was learning, trying, maybe failing, a lot of failing, trying again, and that cycle. So I remember the first time I, for instance, interviewed a customer, because I was really keen in my first product role to speak to customers, but worked in a relatively small startup, didn't have a dedicated UX researcher, and it wasn't a thing. But I thought I need to speak to people because otherwise I'm just flying blind. And I can tell you, Jason, in that first interview, I asked all the leading questions that mankind can even think of. But that triggered me to do it, learn again, see how the experts do it, and apply that next time. And that's how I made that transition. And again, it's the mindset that I still try to bring to what I do, and try to encourage the people I work with to apply a similar mindset.
Yeah, and that's interesting as well. So you're still very much a practitioner, I understand. I mean, I know that you're heading up a big team at Asos, but what do you do kind of day to day at Asos?
It's a real mix, like the product role always is. But a lot of it is, as you say, focused on the people side of things. So I make a big point of having regular catch-ups, whether it's one-to-ones or checking in with people and the people that they work with and stakeholders, just to see what's going on and where help is needed, and making sure we're moving in the right direction. I try not to be too much in the detail, clearly, to avoid the pitfall I mentioned earlier. But at the same time, the way we've set the objectives for people in my team is that ultimately all ladder up to what I'm accountable for, right? So it's not yeah, quite. And then the accountability, it's that classic thing. It goes all the way to the top. So, and I'm not saying I'm at the very top, but what I'm trying to say is we share that accountability, we share that responsibility, and that's where I'm in relevant meetings or conversations, or again, when I have to go into detail, which sometimes I do, and not necessarily detail of writing a user story, but the detail of what are we prioritizing, which way are we heading, product owner or product designer, do you need any support with that? There might be struggles with stakeholders or getting things across. That's the key part. The other key part is education. Again, when I joined Asos nearly 2 years ago, I joined initially as a product management practice lead because there was clearly a need.
What a job title.
It is a good job title, isn't it? I always struggle with that. I think it's the first time I could say it in one sentence without getting lost. But the whole idea of that role was to share best practices and build up that culture of being a product person, having that product mindset, whether you're a product manager or you're not, because it is, in my mind, a mindset. And I still try to do that as part of this role as well.
One thing that's very in vogue these days is almost to the point of becoming a cliche is the concept of kind of empowered cross-functional teams. And then normally at that point, you'll get a PowerPoint with a screenshot from the Spotify website and the 4 quadrants and the taking the hill or whatever. Now, one thing you've brought up before this and kind of touches on what you were just saying about building the team up is this doesn't always just work. Like it's not like you just put everyone in a room, tell them they're empowered, and off they go. So what are some of the challenges that you've faced either here or in previous roles in making that work?
Yeah, I think you're totally right. It's that classic idea of Spotify can do it, create those squads, so can we. And we put people in a group and they'll just deliver, right? They'll work cross-functionally, they'll collaborate as they should. And the common obstacles I have seen, which I write about in the book, are things like people still working in silos. Sometimes you're putting people together that feels slightly threatened even by suddenly having to share success or share responsibility with someone else or other people. A lack of respect or trust is another key component. Again, this idea, put people in a room, but what if they don't like each other or don't respect each other? I always say, particularly in product, my goal is not to be invited to as many birthday parties of colleagues that I can. You don't have to like me as long as you respect and trust. But you'll see a lot with these cross-functional teams that's not there. Or sometimes where they don't have shared goals, they don't have a clear vision, or they don't have guardrails of what they empowered on. So they say, "Oh, we're a group now, we're empowered," but they don't have that kind of what does good look like? What's the North Star metric I need to hit? So you can't just expect a group of people to get together and think, yeah, they're going to do what I think they will be doing or expect them to do without giving them that clarity of direction, giving them a very clear sense of accountability and decision-making powers related to that direction and accountability.
Yeah, it makes sense. And sometimes you hear stories of teams where people or different parts of the teams are almost either directly or indirectly compensated differently or to different goals, which is almost impossible to
Yeah.
then kind of
Yeah.
square that off.
It's a classic dysfunctional family, isn't it? If that, when that happens. But it happens because people get the idea and it sounds great. And I love cross-functional working. I've had the luxury of always having worked that way, where as a product person, you're embedded in a team and you work closely with engineers and designers. But I've also seen the reality that you need a bit of structure around the squad, and you need time to really gel as a group and go through that group formation process.
One of the things you also mentioned in the book and kind of touches again on that is trying to foster that culture of trust and what some would call sort of psychological safety in the teams, and making sure that everyone does trust each other and that everyone is pulling in the same direction. So how do you approach that? Like how do you, because it's not natural for some people, depending on their career. Some people are going to have come from companies with blame cultures. They're going to be coming from command and control structures and stuff like that, which it's that kind of gets ingrained, especially if you've been at other places for too long. So how do you try and break some of that down to make people feel that they can kind of collaborate and, like you said earlier, fail where necessary and not feel bad about it?
Yeah. Couple of things. As a product leader, you can, if you want to call it that, but lead by example. This is one thing that I did learn initially through a book called Radical Candor by Kim Scott, where she talks about caring personally. And caring personally doesn't mean that, everything is great, because she refers as that kind of trait as ruinous empathy. But I think that's really important if you're building a team and you want people to care personally about each other without, again, having to become best friends or just letting each other get away with murder. you have to demonstrate that and what that looks like. So, for instance, a good example for me of caring personally is being able to criticize without discouraging or without blaming. So exactly as you say, that is a big challenge if you're not used to that, or you don't have the tools or the equipment to do that. And when I say equipment, I'm talking about, even the sentences that you can use. How do you start a conversation to say, Jason, this isn't great, without you.
I've heard that before.
No, I'm sure you haven't. Without you walking away, this is about me personally, or what do I do with this feedback, or that didn't feel particularly constructive or helpful. So a lot of what I try to do is enable my people, so to speak, so the product owners and designers, who then can bring that forward, take that forward in their teams when they work with engineers or stakeholders, is how do you have those conversations? How do you pick your battles? Because again, being smarter about those things really help to build that trust. And the other key thing, which we touched on, is shared goals. Really important. If we're just very transparent about what we're doing, talking about and having difficult conversations at times to say, this is your responsibility, this is your accountability towards that shared goal. This is where there might be overlap, and this is how we're going to deal with that. And again, sometimes you can preempt these things. Perfect. Fantastic if it happens. Other times you have to go through that process of it not working and then having a conversation about it and say, okay, how will we do that next time? But going through that journey where you at least have those conversations, say, you stepped on my toes here, or this was ineffective what we did here, or how we collaborated. How can we do that differently next time? Will get you to a high performing kind of empowered team.
Yeah, it is difficult because everyone's got the same kind of internal monologue as everyone else, I guess. And ultimately, as soon as I think Radical Candor is a fantastic book, by the way, but I can understand that not everyone's going to be ready for that, and they're all automatically going to get defensive. And I think that you're completely right. It's just about just demonstrating that for as much as possible and kind of trying to break that down to some point.
And I think particularly if you, going back to your earlier question about product leadership and managing product people, you have a role there also in one-to-ones where you can give people in a safe space, enable people who might come to you and say, Marc, I feel a bit uncomfortable giving feedback or difficult conversations, or I'm dreading that interaction with this stakeholder, to talk through that and work through how you would approach that. Sometimes I drive my colleagues nuts because I do role play with them, where I'll pretend to be a difficult stakeholder, or
I hope you don't do voices and stuff.
no, but or a colleague that you have to have a difficult conversation with. And the reason why I'm doing it, because some people do find it helpful in a safe space to go through that exercise and understand is, how do I position it? How do I listen actively to the other person, and really apply that kind of way of being open and being constructive, which sometimes, as you say, it doesn't come naturally to a lot of people.
Yeah, I think one of the things from the book, and I know I've seen it in other places as well, is the concept of things like premortems and stuff like that, where I guess you can have kind of just like you said, just like a practice conversation about why it all went wrong, but without the additional pressure of it actually having gone wrong, which maybe sort of takes some of the air out of it, which probably pretty good.
It is, I've seen it over the years how liberating that can be, because as you say, you're with a premortem, you look at all the things that potentially could go wrong. You do it as a group, you talk about it, you prioritize the biggest risks and talk, and then constructively how to mitigate those risks. But it can be so liberating to have those conversations.
Absolutely. Another thing that I personally think is quite critical, and I know that you've mentioned it as well, is around sort of mentorship and coaching. And I know that they're different things, but it feels to me that as you're coming up through the ranks as like a junior member of staff, a junior product person, again, things like your book and maybe even things like this podcast can help with some of it, but to have actual mentorship on the way up, but also when you get to, for want of a better word, the top, so like even when you get to a leadership position, I think that there's this kind of cliche that, oh yeah, well you've arrived now and you're fine, but actually that mentorship from my side, I think it's still important all the way through your career. There's never a point where it's just okay, but I know that you're keen on mentorship and that you're participating in a lot of mentorship. So what does mentorship mean to you?
So mentorship, so I make a distinction between coaching and mentorship, and you could say there's overlap, and that would be a whole different podcast. But the mentorship relationships, the relationships that I've had there are typically more long-standing, where it's not about, I've got a specific problem or I want to go for a specific opportunity. Can you help me? Which for me feels more like coaching. But mentorship is, you have a long-standing relationship, couple of years with some people that I mentor, and equally people that mentor me, where they're with you on a journey, and they're, I talk in the book about a safety net. These are the people that you can turn to if you want to share experiences, if you would like them to make certain connections. Typically, these are people that are in a place that you aspire to get to eventually, or have achieved things that you aspire to achieve, so that they have that real life experience that they can share with you. And at the best of times, they will just act as a sounding board, where you talk to them based on their experience. They'll give you some advice. They might make introductions for you. Whereas with coaching, I think generally the focus is much more about asking those questions to enable you to solve a problem or to get to the next step. So slightly different dynamic.
Yeah, it's fair enough. And again, I mean, I've mentored people in the past. I've had mentors and been coached. And I think the most important thing is exactly what you say, just having that outlet and that ability to have someone put a metaphorical arm around your shoulder, especially these days.
Yeah.
And just tell you that it's going to be okay, or that it's normal. Because certainly when I started out, even way before my product career, there were times where I just thought that everything was the worst thing in the world ever, and this has never happened to anyone ever before.
Yep.
And that I've failed in a way that no one's ever failed before. And of course, that's completely untrue. You use some boxing metaphors in the book about sort of ducking and leaning in and leaning out and stuff like that. Now, I've never boxed, but I've done some martial arts in my time. I do remember my first time I got punched in the face. I had a head guard on, but still everything just went completely blank for a second. So I know what it feels like.
Yeah.
But I guess aside from the metaphorical boxing stuff that you put in there about rolling with the punches, what do you see the role of exercise in general being as an avenue to kind of diffuse some of the tension that builds up sort of day to day, week to week in your career?
Yeah, you mentioned outlet and exercise. Again, for me, it's boxing predominantly, is such an important outlet. It's almost, particularly with boxing, I find that's probably one of the reasons why I love it so much. You don't have time to think about stuff that's going outside of the ring. Because if you do that, and trust me, I've been there, Jason, where I did that, where my mind would wander off as I was sparring with someone, and before I knew it, I was punched in the face or worse. And I think it's really important. You see, particularly now when people are obviously more isolated, having to work from home. So the pressures that you'd feel on a normal day in the office, whether you're working as a product manager or not as a product manager, it doesn't matter. I think we all need outlets. And for some people, that is boxing or running or swimming, whatever it is. But I think it's really important, particularly for product, when it can feel like an overwhelming role, because there's so many different aspects to it. So many different, there's a lot of context switching involved, I find. So it's important to find your outlet, whether that's exercise or for some people it's art or just going for a walk, where you can just let that all go and just regenerate some energy before you can go again.
Yeah, it's just about being able to reduce the volume a little bit, I guess. I mean, I remember once sitting in an interview where I was on a panel interviewing someone for a company, not my current company. And the guy next to me, he was like, one thing you have to be aware of is that everything's on fire. And that's okay if you like it. But obviously not everyone always likes it. And actually, even people that do like things being on fire, I think sometimes they want to kind of stamp it down a little bit. So definitely agree with that. Yeah, for me, it's running mostly at the moment. The good thing about running is that after the first little bit, you don't really think about anything anymore because you're too busy concentrating on your breathing and concentrating on putting your feet. So you have to run for a bit. You can't just run round the corner because that won't do it. But definitely just anything to just give you that chance to clear the decks.
100%. Yeah.
And at the risk of increasing your stress level even more, imagine that you're at a barbecue or party or a social event of some fashion, and a stranger comes up to you and says, "Hey, Mark, what is it you do?" How do you explain what you do to the uninitiated?
I typically start with, when I say I'm a product manager, people are like, so product, what do you mean?
So you're a project manager, huh?
Exactly. So I start talking about, you see, this app that you use or this website. What I do is I work together with the people and we focus together on these and these aspects of the product, the customer experience, and that it's working for you, and then making sure we're building the right thing. And that's how I typically start explaining it. And that works well because people relate to that physical or digital product that they're familiar with. And then when I start saying, I work with the engineers, making sure they're building the right thing, but I also work with designers to make sure we're designing the right experience so it's easier for you to use. And that helps me and stops me from having to hide, because I totally hear where you're coming from there.
I guess at the end of that conversation, though, you pull out a copy of your book.
Yes.
And just give it to them and
always. That's another reason why I write these books, saying, I'm just going to stop blabbering now. Here's my book, and just,
So where's the best place to get hold of you if people want to continue the conversation or hear more of your wisdom?
First of all, if you want to not hear necessarily, because it's not an audio book yet, but if you want to find my books, I'm on Amazon. If you want to find me on LinkedIn, that's a really good place. You can find me. My name is Marc Abraham, Marc with the C, or I'm also quite active on Twitter and Medium, and you can find me there under MAA1. I
will try to find enough room in the description for the episode to fit all of that in. Well, that's been a fascinating chat and journey with you through some of the darker sides of product management. Obviously, I hope that it inspires at least some people to be a bit more open or think a bit around how they can deflect some of that tension and kind of get themselves to it. Marc, obviously, been a pleasure, and I hope that we both stay in touch. And thanks very much for coming on.
Absolutely, really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me, Jason.
For a short period of time, you can win a copy of Marc's book, Managing Product Equals Managing Tension, by sharing the episode link on social media with the hashtag #OneNightInProduct. Visit onenightinproduct.com for more details. Otherwise, you can pick up a copy in all good bookshops, and in any case, thanks for listening, and come back soon.